All right, so now let's think about what the federal government is trying to do to keep the economy alive as we go through this shelter-at-home situation that we have right now. All right. You might remember that when we talked about some of the problems with federal government spending, we discussed crowding out, right? We discussed lags, and we discussed debt. We might think about those three problems right now. Crowding out, not such a big problem because the government is doing policies that don't really affect crowding out. But two, crowding out is most prevalent when people are already economically active, right? So for example, if the government starts a new agency and that agency hires me to work for it, that's crowding out a state government operation. Or another example, you're down working at a restaurant and the government opens up a new agency, you leave the restaurant. That's crowding out because it's affecting, in that case, the private economy. Right now, people aren't working much. So there's not much crowding out to do because you're already at home, right? So crowding out is not going to be such a big concern right now. Debt obviously is a concern, and we'll think about some of those consequences here at the end of this video. But the third one, the one the government really has thought about the most here, I think, is lags. Okay? So a key goal here is to avoid lags. If you recall, lags is just the idea that it takes a long time for the government to do stuff. If the government decides that they want to create some sort of new program, they're usually really slow to do so. This is not a good time to be slow, right? You can agree with that. This is a really bad time for the U.S. government to be slow because people went from having a really good economy to a terrible economy practically overnight. And so the government needs to step in and try to revert some of those adverse effects in the economy as quickly as possible. And so if you hear a lot of things being critical about the federal government right now, I would say give them a break a little bit. They're having to act very fast. And when you have to act very fast, that means that you're going to make mistakes. And there's going to be some growing pains. And we're seeing that, and I think that really was inevitable. So, if we think back to 2009, the most recent financial crisis that we had, 2009 was terrible. I don't expect this one to be so bad, right? I don't think there's any reason to expect economically this to be as bad. But as I mentioned in the last video, there's still an amazing amount of downside risk for our current economic situation. In 2009, there was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Which was aimed to stimulate the economy very quickly, provided unemployment benefits, created this huge spending situation in the U.S. where different entities could apply for government grants. And the effect was roughly $800 billion in new spending by the U.S. government. All right? I think as I mentioned before in the prior video on this, this was the most the government had ever spent on any individual act. And I think it was the most any government had ever spent on earth, ever. Once you adjust for inflation and everything, it was the biggest spending bill ever. Well, 2020, we got a new act on our hand. It's called the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES, as it'll often be referred to. So when you hear the government, when you hear the news, they're talking about things like, these stimulus checks that are sent to individuals, or you hear them talking about government providing loans to businesses. It's pretty much all part of this CARES Act. Anytime the government wants to pass a new bill, it's got to pass a new bill, right? Anytime it wants to create a new policy, it's going to have to create a law to do that. So what that means is a lot of times when they pass these laws, there's a lot of stuff in them, right? So they don't have to keep passing new and new laws and running them through Senate and everything. So, as you may have heard, the spending on this is $2.2 trillion, which even after adjusting for inflation is more than twice what was spent in 2009. So this is a huge, huge bill, right? when I was living through this last one here, I thought to myself, I don't know if we'll ever spend that much money in U.S. government again. Well, it's just 11 years later, and here we are with this massive spending bill. And I just want to talk a little bit about some of the different policies that are included in this. And I don't want to spend too much time on it, all right, because, facts are, to me, not as interesting as theories and mathematical ideas. Facts, you easily forget them, but I just want to give you just some basic, some of the key points, I guess, from this bill. So I'm going to start with a couple that you've probably heard of. You may have heard of the PPP. This is one that's gotten a lot of criticism because they've had a lot of problems rolling this thing out. They were very quick in creating this policy. What this basically did was it provided loans to businesses, specifically small businesses as the government defines it, but small businesses can be very large in the government's eyes. It provided loans to businesses to keep their employees working. And in some cases, that means the employees maybe weren't really doing much, but it kept them on the payroll, okay? I think this is a pretty logical plan for the government. The idea here is if these businesses just lay off their workers, and then 2 months from now, businesses can start working again, if they can start going back to their normal operating hours, there's going to be a big disruption because the workers are disconnected from the employers at that point, right? So the idea here is let's pretend that these workers are still working so that when the economy is able to reopen, they really can go back to being employed. If this didn't pass, you can imagine a lot of these employees would be off applying for jobs elsewhere. This will keep them connected to these businesses. So it probably makes a lot of sense to do this. All right. The problem with this is that they allowed the businesses to apply for these loans, but they basically ran out of funds. And there were a lot of businesses that were applying for loans right at the beginning. Right when this was initialized, businesses went in and started applying for these loans, but they never actually got processed. The loans never got processed. And so this $350 billion was exhausted before a lot of businesses even had a chance to borrow any money. And that's where there was a lot of criticism that the government should have put more care into this program. But they were trying to be fast, so it was tough, right? It was tough to do things really well. And what's really nice about these loans is they aren't really loans for most businesses. The loans are forgivable if the businesses can prove that they kept these employees. And so of that $350 billion, you might expect that a very tiny fraction of that actually gets returned to the U.S. government. They're calling it a loan because businesses have to pay them back if they don't hold up their end of the bargain, which is basically to keep all their employees employed during that period. All right? So that's $350 billion spent there. Big program, but that only gets us, a small fraction of the way to that $2.2 trillion. Here's probably the one you know the most about. The $300 billion in stimulus checks. This is what a lot of the news outlets are calling it, just stimulus checks. This is the $1.2 thousand or $1,200 to individuals, and $500 to dependents 16 and under. Checks that went out, probably you know about these because you may have gotten one, or certainly your parents did. Most people got checks, right? So if my parents who are retired, they're getting a check. They haven't gotten it yet. Me and my wife, we got our checks already. Chances are you're in the demographic that didn't get checks. Some of you did, but probably most of you didn't. Dependents who are between the ages, I think, 17 and 24. If you're between 17 and 24 and a dependent on your parents' tax forms, well, then you didn't get anything, all right? Tough break there, okay? I don't entirely understand what the logic for that was, but you guys were excluded from this bill. You probably didn't get anything. If you are not filed as a dependent, then you did get a check, and you might check with your parents to see what your situation is. If you're not a dependent and you didn't get a check, something is probably wrong and you're going to want to look into that. So this was provided to just about anybody. There were some interesting complications here in terms of how this was handled. If you'd filed your tax return already, it was going to be based on the 2019 tax year. If you hadn't filed yet, then it was based on the 2018 tax year. I kind of messed myself up. I didn't file yet this year because they pushed back the deadline. We had a kid last year, wasn't on the tax, it wasn't known in the tax records, so we missed out on $500 that we otherwise would have gotten. So be it, right? So this was a pretty big bill as well, but you can see we're still nowhere near to finishing that $2.2 trillion. So let me add in a few more programs here. And I'm not going to try to go through everything. It's a big bill. There's a lot included. It's going through some of the bigger points here. The government created $250 billion in new unemployment benefits for those that are unemployed. This includes $600 a month increase in benefits for those that are unemployed and able to receive benefits. It also made it easier to be considered unemployed, and they pushed back some of the time requirements on this. Usually when you start receiving unemployment benefits, those benefits run out, and they extended how long they last. This is a big chunk of money because remember, we have 22 million people newly filing unemployment claims, which is way more than it normally is. So there's going to be a lot of people getting these benefits. And this amount could go way up if this period lasts for longer than just a month or two. So these benefits that are being paid out could be $250 billion, could be even more. I'm just going to mention one more here that you might care about. This is something I actually didn't know about until I started researching this for today's video. But $14 billion was given to universities to distribute to students. Interesting, right? Interesting. So I mentioned before that a lot of you didn't get any funding through those stimulus checks. Well, here might be your avenue to get some funding. Georgia College, from what I actually found a document that listed Georgia College for getting about $4 million at a maximum. And that comes out to more than $500 per student. Now it appears in order to get the funds, you have to actually show that you had some hardship. So for example, let's say you went home and you had to buy a laptop and you have a receipt for that. You might be able to claim that you need funding because of that, right? That's just one example, but colleges apparently are scrambling trying to figure out how they're going to distribute these checks to students. They're not going to give it to just anyone, but if you're the type of person who maybe already needed financial aid, maybe you're getting the Pell Grant, it might be easy for you to get some of these funds. I have no idea how Georgia College is going to handle this. I'm not connected to that, but this may be an avenue for you to get some funds. And you can see $14 billion, that's a lot of money, but compared to the large amount here, it's really just pennies. But I wanted to bring that up because it might affect you directly. And finally, I just want to list just a few other interesting things that the federal government has done. They delayed tax filing. I mentioned that earlier. That's not something they've done that I know of in many years. They delayed retirement contribution rules, deadlines. So for example, if you want to contribute to an IRA, an individual retirement account, that deadline for the 2019 year is usually April 15th, tax day. Well, they pushed that back as well. So a lot of the stuff that would have been due on tax day is being pushed back. They made it possible to withdraw a lot of retirement funds if you were financially affected. So for example, let's say you've got 80 grand in your 401k. Normally if you withdraw from that, you're going to face a 10% penalty. But for those that are affected, who are affected some way, they're able to withdraw from their 401k without facing any penalty. They will still have to pay taxes, but this means that a lot of the 401ks and 457s and all these retirement plans, probably things you don't know too much about right now, but you will care a lot about when you're employed, those funds are becoming available to those workers. It's about trying to keep people financially stable as they get through this hardship. And just one more note here, they increased the tax benefit for charitable giving. And I could go on and on with a lot of things that they've done, but now if you're giving money to charities, you're going to get a bigger tax return for those charitable givings that you've done. So I could go on and on about a lot of things that the federal government has done. The bottom line is it's a huge bill, right? $2.2 trillion is a lot of money spent, and there's a lot of complex things going on in these bills. Some things are quick, sending out the checks pretty quick. There's been some problems with some people not receiving their funding, but for most people, they've already received their checks. The idea is now that they can pay their rent, they can pay their mortgage, keep the economy looking normal as long as possible. So that's pretty easy. And then you've got things like this $14 billion money given to colleges. There's going to be a much bigger lag there as the colleges figure out how to distribute those funds to the college students. All right? So thinking about some of the long-term effects, maybe the most obvious concern here is debt. And oh my goodness, this thing is going to really make our debt situation far worse than it already was. So it looks like the 2020 budget deficit will be about $3.8 trillion. $3.8 trillion budget deficit. All right, now why is it so high? Well, in addition to that spending that the government's doing, right, that $2.2 trillion that the government is spending, on top of that, the government's going to receive less revenues than they normally would. The number one source of government revenues is tax income, specifically income tax revenues. Those aren't going to be coming in, right? So the government's going to be receiving less in revenues, and they're going to be paying out more simultaneously. All right, so you've got the big bill passed, you've got a reduction in tax revenues, and third, the government already had a deficit for some reason, even though the economy was good. So you add all that together, you end up with this unbelievably large government deficit. I'm not sure if this is the largest that the U.S. government ever has, but certainly it's the largest when we're not in some sort of major war, right? So it's really unbelievable how much the government is spending. This is about 19% of GDP, just to put that in context. So it's about 1/5 of the U.S. economy is comprised of just the government deficit for just this year. That kind of just shows how much the government is spending right now and how bad things are. That's really unbelievable. And so this is going to really ramp up the debt. A couple of chapters ago, you guys had some debt figures from like a year and a half ago. Well, let's update those to today. So this is the newest data I could find. The total debt is now about $24.2 trillion. It's growing very rapidly, right? Part of that's because of the spending bill that the government is spending right now. And in terms of the net public debt, remember that the government owes itself money? Well, the net public debt is growing basically at the same dollar amount. The government owes itself money, but that money really isn't changing much over time. It's not really growing. It's the other type of debt that is growing. So this net public debt is about $18.2 trillion, right? And remember that the difference between the two is what the government owes itself. And what I'm suggesting here is that $6 trillion the government owes itself, that hasn't really changed too much. So for every dollar the total debt goes up, the net public debt is also going up by about $1. And the expectation here is in 2024, the total debt is on pace now to be about $40 trillion if we continue the same types of practices that we have already. That's pretty rough. And so what you can kind of imagine here is that, again, if this lasts for a long period of time, the government's going to have to keep sending out stimulus checks. I guess it's going to have to keep trying to borrow money as long as it's able to do so. And so this debt, I don't know how high it could be if we continue to go through these periods where people aren't working. So what can we learn from this? Well, I think we can learn that we probably need to do a better job of preparing for disasters. There is ample evidence showing that people tend to underestimate the possibility of low likelihood events. What I mean by that is if there's something that has a 3% chance of happening, people tend to just basically ignore it, when in reality you probably should prepare for those things. So we probably should do a better job of preparing for things like pandemics. In terms of economic responses, the government should probably have a plan in place. That goes again with planning for a pandemic. And then more broad strokes, don't carry a huge deficit when the economy is good. I'm going to write it up here just in case you have the video on mute. Because it's something that economists scream all the time. Most economists are fine with the government running a deficit sometimes, but they shouldn't be running it when the economy is so strong, like it has been for the last couple of years. Those are big mistakes to run those deficits for so many years. Now, what is the fix? People will say, well, Trump shouldn't have done it. Well, Trump's just one guy, right? People voted him in. People voted other politicians in. Probably there needs to be some way to overhaul this system, but I don't see what the answer is. Politicians generally like to spend money because their constituents like it. Politicians generally like to cut taxes because their constituents like it. So maybe the answer is more financial education so that people understand that if we keep running these deficits, it's going to get harder and harder for the government to borrow money. It's going to get harder and harder for the government to pay back what it owes. So I guess the big takeaway here is pretend that an economic collapse is always on the horizon so that you're more prepared to handle it when you get there. That means preparing for disaster, 1, and 2, not spending all your damn money so that right now things wouldn't be so hard for us.